Edward the Confessor, ruled from 1042 until his death in 1066. His reign marked a period of transition for the kingdom, as the once powerful Anglo-Saxon monarchy found itself increasingly challenged by external and internal forces. Edward's reign is characterized by relative peace compared to the earlier tumultuous period of Viking invasions, but it was also a time of growing political instability, a divided nobility, and tensions with the rising power of the Norman and Scandinavian aristocracies. Edward the Confessor's legacy is complex. Revered as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church and remembered for his piety, he is often seen as a figure of religious devotion who struggled to control the rapidly changing political landscape of England. His reign, while marked by significant developments in religion, law, and architecture, ultimately ended in a succession crisis that paved the way for the Norman conquest of 1066. Edward was born around 1003, the son of Ethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. His early life was marked by upheaval and political instability, as his father, Ethelred, faced repeated Viking invasions and was eventually forced into exile in 1013. When Knut the Great, the Danish king, took the English throne in 1016, Edward's family was ousted from the kingdom, and the young Edward went into exile in Normandy, where he was raised by his maternal relatives, the Normans. During this time, he forged strong connections with the Norman nobility, which would later influence his reign as king. Edward's exile was marked by a lack of political control over England. The kingdom was divided between the ruling Danish dynasty of Knut and the Anglo-Saxon nobility that had been displaced. After Knut's death in 1035, England was left in a period of instability, as his sons, Harold I Harefoot and Harthacnut, contested the throne. Edward's half-brother, Harthacnut, eventually succeeded to the throne in 1040, but he died suddenly in 1042, leaving the throne open for Edward. Edward's claim to the throne was rooted in his royal Anglo-Saxon lineage, as the son of Ethelred and Emma. However, his ascension was not without challenges. When Harthacnut died, the English nobility, which was tired of Danish rule, sought a legitimate Anglo-Saxon heir. Edward's return from Normandy was seen as an opportunity to restore Anglo-Saxon rule, and he was invited to take the throne. The fact that Edward had spent much of his life in exile, particularly in Normandy, made him a somewhat distant figure in the eyes of the English nobility, but his bloodline and legitimacy ultimately led to his coronation. Edward was crowned king in 1042, marking the end of the Danish monarchy in England and the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon line. His ascension, however, was not entirely smooth. England was still divided, with tensions between the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the remnants of Danish influence. Edward was a king without a substantial base of power in England itself, and he needed to rely on the support of the nobility and the church to secure his rule. Edward the Confessor faced significant challenges in the early years of his reign. Though he was accepted as king, his power was still tenuous. The nobles, many of whom had supported the Danish monarchy, were reluctant to place full control in Edward's hands, and his early years on the throne were spent attempting to consolidate his authority. This period saw the growing influence of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, particularly under the leadership of powerful figures like Godwin, the Earl of Wessex. The Godwin family would play a critical role in Edward's reign, as Godwin himself was one of the most powerful nobles in England. Though initially loyal to Edward, Godwin and his family would come into conflict with the king over issues of power and influence. Edward's reliance on the Godwins early in his reign allowed him to maintain control over the kingdom, but it also created significant tensions that would come to a head in later years. One of the most important aspects of Edward's reign was his relationship with the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the Church. Edward was a deeply pious man, and his religious devotion influenced many of his decisions. Throughout his reign, Edward was committed to strengthening the Church and promoting monastic reform, which aligned him with the religious elite in England. However, his personal piety was often at odds with the political realities of kingship. As a ruler, Edward was often hesitant to make decisions that might alienate powerful nobles or disrupt the established order. Edward's close relationship with the Church was reflected in his efforts to strengthen ties with Rome. His reign saw the continued influence of the Church in England, with increased monastic activity and the construction of new religious buildings. One of the most notable examples of this is the construction of Westminster Abbey, which was commissioned by Edward as a place of worship and a symbol of royal authority. Westminster Abbey would later become the site of Edward's burial, and has since become one of the most iconic religious buildings in England. However, Edward's religious devotion also led to political challenges. As a king, he had to balance his commitment to the Church with the need to manage the powerful Anglo-Saxon nobility, particularly the Godwin family. Edward's reliance on the Church for support and his desire to secure England's place within the wider Christian world often put him at odds with secular nobility, especially when it came to issues of land and power. Edward's reign was increasingly marked by tensions with the Godwin family. Initially, Edward had relied on Godwin and his sons for support, but over time, the Godwins became more powerful, to the point where they appeared to challenge Edward's authority. The conflict between Edward and the Godwins reached a breaking point in 1051, when Edward exiled Godwin's son, Harold, and several other members of the family. The reasons for this conflict were multifaceted. Edward had been attempting to assert his authority over the nobility, and the Godwins' growing influence threatened to undermine his control. Additionally, Edward had a strong sense of what he believed was rightfully his, including certain lands and powers, and the Godwins were seen as a rival faction seeking to carve out their own domain. However, this conflict would not last long. In 1052, the Godwins returned to England, raised an army, and forced Edward to reconcile with them. The Godwin family regained their lands and power, and Harold Godwinson, in particular, would go on to become one of the most powerful men in England. This period of tension between Edward and the Godwins marked a turning point in Edward's reign, as it showed the limits of his power and his inability to control the powerful noble families in his kingdom. As Edward's reign continued, the issue of succession became increasingly urgent. Edward had no children, and his failure to secure a clear heir to the throne became one of the most significant problems of his later years. The lack of a direct heir set the stage for future conflict, as powerful figures in England began to position themselves for control of the throne. Edward's cousin, William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, a claim that would later play a crucial role in the events leading up to the Norman conquest. At the same time, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England, also positioned himself as a potential successor to the throne. The rivalry between these two claimants would become the focal point of English politics in the years following Edward's death. In 1065, Harold Godwinson led a rebellion against Edward's authority, forcing the king to submit to the wishes of the powerful nobles. Edward's health had been failing for some time, and the weakening of his authority contributed to the growing instability in the kingdom. In his final years, Edward was unable to prevent the powerful factions from maneuvering for power. Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066, after a long period of illness. His death set in motion a series of events that would change the course of English history. Edward's death left a power vacuum, as no clear successor had been named. Harold Godwinson was crowned king shortly thereafter, but this was contested by William of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. Edward's death thus set the stage for the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. Although Edward's reign was relatively peaceful in comparison to the earlier years of Viking invasions, his failure to secure a clear line of succession and his inability to decisively control the kingdom's powerful nobles created the conditions for a dynastic struggle that would end Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Edward's legacy, however, is not without significance. He was remembered as a pious king who sought to maintain peace and stability despite the challenges he faced. His canonization as a saint and the construction of Westminster Abbey are testament to his commitment to the Christian faith and his efforts to enhance England's religious standing. In many ways, Edward's reign was a final attempt to preserve the Anglo-Saxon monarchy before it was engulfed by external forces.